Now, in the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. In the fourth gospel, the first human being that we greet is John. He's not a prophet. He's not a baptizer. He is a voice crying out in the wilderness. A voice crying out in the wilderness. He is a witness to testify to what he has seen and heard, so that others can recognize and believe as well. That's what a witness is, isn't it? It's somebody who has seen something and heard something and testifies to its truth so that others can recognize and believe that truth as well. That's what a witness does. And that's who John is in the fourth gospel, a voice crying out in the wilderness, bearing testimony and witnessing to the power of God. Just a guy with a voice crying out in the wilderness. But at least he's crying out. More often than not, witnesses' voices are silent, or at the best, muted or muffled. For those in the wilderness who need a witnessing voice and instead hear silence, how devastating. How devastating. When you are in the wilderness, and I'm not talking about the Appalachian Trail here, I'm talking about places that are bleak and barren and very lonely. When you are in the wilderness, because I'm banking, you have been in some wildernesses in your life, I have, where it has felt bleak and I have felt lost. Don't you yearn for a voice crying out? Don't you yearn to hear that voice crying out to remind you that you are not alone and that there is a way out, that you are not abandoned, that someone has come to find you and to be with you? Don't you yearn that? Don't you want a witness? Someone who will cry out, someone who will make some noise, someone who will be a voice crying out in the wilderness. And if that's true for those of us who are either in the wilderness today, have been in the wilderness, or will be in the wilderness, if that is true for us who have wilderness experiences, isn't that also true of others who need to hear our voices? Noisy voices. Others who are in the wilderness who maybe need to hear a noisy voice reminding them that they are not alone, that they have not been abandoned, and that there is, in fact, a way out, a noisy voice. Because the cost of silence or muffled mumble cries is that evil will prevail. The cost of silence or mumbling is that evil will prevail. Last summer, we had a pilgrimage that a number of us went on from New Orleans to Detroit as we followed the Underground Railroad. When we reached Cincinnati, Ohio, we went to the Freedom Center, the National Underground Railroad Museum. We had a tour. Our tour guide was a white woman who knew about the content of the museum, but was incredibly unencumbered by it. Flat and totally unencumbered by the knowledge that she had. One of the last things we did on the tour was to walk inside a log building. It was a slave pen, an actual used slave pen that the museum had brought and reconstructed inside of it. A slave pen, a place where men, women, and children were chained and kept for days, either on their way to be sold or on their way to be delivered to the ones who had bought them. We walked into the slave pen and we sat down, and this unencumbered by her knowledge woman walked to a back corner, flipped open a trunk, brought out metal shackles and said, "Here, would anybody like to touch these?" It was devastating. If you could have seen the faces of our pilgrims. A woman totally unencumbered by any kind of knowledge about what it means to live in the wilderness. We had a mantra that we said a lot on this trip. And our pilgrims are here today, so up on your feet, pilgrims. Up on your feet. Okay. And what was the mantra?
Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Okay. It's from the book of Romans. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. In that place, I asked them to say the mantra with me. So join them. Say it with us. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil. And then I asked them to say it a little bit louder. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And then I said louder. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And then I said louder, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. There were two black men outside the slave pen who witnessed our voices. And as we were wandering around the museum, they approached me later on, and they came up to me and they said, "Who are you people?"
Amen. Amen.
And I explained, and their faces and their spirits and their souls rejoiced at our presence, because what they witnessed was a voice crying out to them in the wilderness. In a wilderness, they heard voices. Later that evening, when we were processing the day, which we did regularly, one of the pilgrims looked at me and she said, "Reverend Flo, why did you make us say it so loud?" And I said, because that is an evil, evil place. And we needed to say something with conviction and power and strength so that we could banish evil and remind evil that it is God who will prevail. In that ugly evil building. Pilgrims' voices raised louder and louder and louder, voices crying out in the wilderness, noisy and loud, to make clear about the power of God in the world. The prophet Isaiah today tells us about exiles who have returned home, people who were ripped away from their land and their families and sent away in exile. The prophet Isaiah teaches us today about exiles who have returned home to a land that is a mess, with buildings that are destroyed, flocks that are scattered, lands that are overgrown. And despite being able to return home, you can imagine how easily they must have felt just devastated. But the prophet says, noisily, get a grip. The prophet says, I am a witness that God will give you a jubilee year. I am a witness in the place that feels the most devastating that it can to you, that God has promised you a jubilee year, with the return of property to the original owner, to the release of indentured servants, and for land that now can be recouped, rested, and finally productive. Isaiah witnesses God and identifies God and testifies to God's favor, that they have returned from the wilderness, that God has set them free, and that they are now a new creation, and that the wilderness will not prevail. There are so many wildernesses that we live with in the world today, not just for exiles returning to their homes, but here in this nation. Wildernesses abound. We read about it every single night. In the world, there are wildernesses that abound with people who feel lost and abandoned. So where are our witnesses? Who will be the witnesses in this world of wilderness? Who will be the ones who will testify to the favor of God, that God favors justice and not violence? Who will be the noise makers in our world, if not you? So the question today is, can I get a witness? The question today is, can I get a testify? Can I get some noise? Can I get a witness? Can I get you to testify today that God will prevail in any wilderness that anyone we know lives in? Paul's letter to the Thessalonians is probably the earliest Christian writing that we have. It was written soon after, a few years after the crucifixion and resurrection. That extraordinary letter of witness to the power of God over even crucifixion. And Paul says, do not quench the Spirit. When we keep silent, we quench the Spirit. Do not keep silent. Be a noisy voice crying out in the wilderness. Be a witness. Testify. And for God's sake, make some noise for Jesus. Amen.